What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the early slate version of the Ship My Money show for Thursday, July 11th. Gonna kind of try and combine this one into the two shows that I've been doing lately. Doing a brief overview at the top, just going through quickly game by game, looking at pitching, hitting, all of that, and then taking a look at potentially where I would be in tournaments if the slate started right now. The caveat for that for this show is I did try and adjust something in my lineup building process, and I don't like the way that it turned out. So I do think that it's likely I end up playing lineups that look a little bit different than what I'll have on the screen today. But I'll talk about that more as I go through it. Basically, just ended up a little bit more concentrated on one team than I typically am or would like to be as a result of the stuff that I messed around with. But I'm gonna just try and combine those two shows. Obviously, on a 4-game slate, strategy wise, things get a little bit more interesting because you have less opportunity cost everywhere. Raw ownership is higher across the board. So we'll talk about that as usual and can take a look at it as far as the lineups that I did build goes as well. Just trying to finish updating everything that I need in front of me. But starting with just quickly going through the slate, looking at each game individually. You have a couple of good hitters parks on the slate. You have a couple of good pitchers parks. We don't have any weather concerns, so that's nice. The hitters parks obviously being Milwaukee and Cincinnati, the pitchers parks being New York and Detroit. In the Cleveland and Detroit game, Spencer Howard going for Cleveland, Jack Flaherty for Detroit. Howard not getting any ownership, doesn't really deserve any. He's really cheap. He does have a good matchup. That's about the extent of things to say about him. Jack Flaherty has been great this year. He has a very tough strikeout matchup against the Guardians, but it is a good pitcher's park. It is a 4-game slate, 33% K percentage this year, 4% walk percentage, 2.33 xFIP. Do keep in mind, though, that even though it's a 4-game slate, there is really good pitching on this slate. So you're still only getting around 23% ownership coming into Flaherty, around a 15% chance of being optimal. Offensively, the Tigers look okay against Howard. Cleveland does have a good bullpen, though. So, even having a relatively weak starter isn't as beneficial here because Cleveland has good relievers. The park also not good for hitting home runs. If we look at overall stacks, most of these teams are pretty lumped together, Detroit being one of them, Cleveland also being one of them. Next, we have the Nats taking on the Mets in another pitcher-friendly park. About a 9 total, it looks like, in this game. Mackenzie Gore, David Peterson. Gore, obviously a good pitcher as well. Pitching on this slate is absolutely loaded after having a 10-game slate yesterday with basically nobody good. Mackenzie Gore striking out 27% of hitters this year, 3.61 xFIP. Not the best matchup against the Mets. They are a difficult team to strike out. The wind is also blowing out at about 15 miles per hour. So a little bit more favorable hitting conditions today than normal. 1, because it's a day game, and then 2, because of the wind blowing out there. But Gore getting around 19% ownership, showed up as optimal about 23% of the time for me. David Peterson looks like a pretty solid SP2 value on DraftKings. Probably not somebody that you would be considering on FanDuel where you only need one pitcher, and probably not getting a ton of him on DraftKings either because you do have such good high upside options elsewhere. But if you do need to pay down, he's projected for about 19% ownership, showed up as optimal about 22% of the time. It's not a great strikeout matchup against the Nats. He's not a great strikeout pitcher, especially in the context of this slate. His strikeout numbers this year are down from previous years. Smaller sample size, 16% strikeout percentage. That probably does go up going forward. But getting to him here is mostly just if you can't afford a better pitcher as an SP2. He is a little bit underpriced at 6,800. Rockies facing the Reds once again in Cincinnati. Frankie Montas was okay yesterday. Gave up more runs than we would like, but did get, I think it was 7 strikeouts in 7 innings. Obviously, a really good strikeout matchup. And then now you get Hunter Green instead of Frankie Montas. 26.7% K percentage for Green this year. 4.29 xFIP in one of the best spots that you can get facing the Rockies outside of Coors Field. He's projected for 48% ownership. He showed up as optimal about 49% of the time for me. So he looks great. Austin Gomber on the other side, 5% ownership, 10% chance of being optimal. I guess kind of today's Kyle Freeland. And I don't mean that in the sense that he's going to go out there and have like the best game he's had in 5 years. I just mean it in the sense that like if you need a dirt cheap SP2 who isn't getting ownership and negatively correlates with the most popular stack on the slate, Austin Gomber does all of that. He's not particularly good. He's not a horrible pitcher, but overall this year only striking out 15.7% of hitters, 4.45 xFIP. If you're getting to him, it's purely for game theory reasons. It's not because of anything to do with his skill set or anything like that. The Reds look great. They are the top stack on the slate going up against Gomber. Gomber does get a positive park shift leaving Coors Field, but it's still a very hitter-friendly park. 177 expected ISO allowed to righties this year, 260 to lefties. So if you do get lefties in the Cincinnati lineup, I wouldn't shy away from them, but righties look fine here as well. He does have a changeup. He throws like 26% of the time to right-handed hitters. So that is why you do see a lower expected ISO for righties. And we do have a Cincinnati lineup with 9 right-handed hitters in it. No Ellie De La Cruz either. So that weakens the stack, but it does also make them less expensive. You do have some pinch hit risk. We have Austin Slater hitting 6th, probably not finishing this game. You'll probably get Will Benson in there at some point. Santiago Espinal's in the lineup. Decent chance that he gets pinch hit for. So if they're trying to just give De La Cruz the day off, then Espinal probably just stays in the game and plays shortstop. If they were just giving De La Cruz like half a day off or something, then he's probably hitting for Espinal at some point. But the fact that De La Cruz, it's not like it's a platoon situation because De La Cruz switch hits. So I don't know if he's just getting a full day off or not. There is some pinch hit risk for Espinal. There's a ton for Austin Slater. Reese Hines has been great so far. He's still cheap. Austin wins at catcher. Not a great hitter, but you do have Tyler Stevenson DHing, so that's still the catcher that you're going to play most often from Cincinnati. So a little bit different, weaker lineup from them than usual, but it does make them cheap also. Colorado on the other side, if you're going there, it's because of Hunter Green's ownership. He's been good at limiting power this year. He's one of the better pitchers on the slate, but he is really, really popular in a good pitcher's park. And then finally, the Pirates taking on the Brewers in Milwaukee. Paul Skeens for Pittsburgh, Aaron Savali for the Pirates. Both of these guys are getting ownership. Skeens because he is Paul Skeens, obviously incredibly good. Can make an argument that he's the best pitcher in baseball already. Probably a top 5 pitcher without any real argument at all. 33.5% K percentage, 2.34 xFIP. It is a park downgrade going into Milwaukee. It is a Milwaukee team that has plenty of power in their lineup. But aside from that, Skeens just looks really, really good. And if anything, he's probably underprojected because he is, at least so far, just truly like a unicorn in terms of dominating every level and not hitting any road bumps. We've already seen him make adjustments at the major league level that have resulted in a new pitch that's really good and that has helped him continue to be really effective. So he does obviously project very, very well here. If anything, I would guess that he's under projected. If you could just look back with hindsight in 3 years and we know exactly what Paul Skeens turned into, probably if anything under projected here. So obviously really like getting there. It is a dangerous park. It is a dangerous matchup, but he is really, really good. Aaron Savali up there with David Peterson as far as your preferred pay down SP2 options. Only 6K here. He's not a great pitcher, but the matchup against Pittsburgh is pretty solid. 23% K percentage, 4.15 xFIP for Savali this season. And we don't have a Pirates lineup yet, but O'Neal Cruz has continued to miss games. Don't know if he'll be back today. If he's out, it does just make the lineup that much weaker. So Savali at 6K, pretty obviously underpriced. Pittsburgh does get a nice park bump going up against Savali. And, we've gone through all the pitchers now. There's not really bad pitching on this slate. Spencer Howard is like the only bad pitcher, and you have the Cleveland bullpen behind him. So even though somebody like Savali is not terrible, Pittsburgh going up against a 30% owned Savali in this park is pretty interesting. The Brewers on the other side, least appealing stack to me. It's I think Skeens is better than Hunter Green by a pretty wide margin, even though Green's a good strikeout pitcher. Skeens is a better strikeout pitcher. He's better at limiting runs. So, you're getting a 50% owned Skeens in a pitcher's park or a hitter's park, rather. You can certainly go to Milwaukee for the leverage on a 4-game slate, but I would rather stack against Green. I would rather stack against Flaherty. I would rather stack against Savali at 30% owned. Skeens seems like the least appealing guy to be stacking against. So now we can take a look at the tournament lineups that I quote unquote would be playing if the slate started right now. Again, I did try and make an adjustment that in theory I think should make my lineup building process better, but clearly still need to work some things out because I got more concentrated than I would like in certain spots. But we can still take a look at these lineups. And, again, it is a 4-game slate. So generally I am going to be a little bit more concentrated than usual, but you can see here just, looking quickly at my overall exposures, the number of Reds hitters specifically that are in like 50% of my lineups. Even on 4-game slates, I typically don't get that concentrated on bats, especially when they're also really popular bats. So I don't really know exactly what went wrong. I do know that I'm going to go back to using the process that I typically use for today's slate and then spend some more time playing around with what I was trying to do. But still, obviously, since he is a good stack. Looking at the pitching, I was getting pretty much exclusively to Hunter Green and Paul Skeens. Mackenzie Gore and Savali were showing up a bit. Gore pretty close to the field. He's projected for like 19% ownership. I got to 14. I was under on Savali. I wasn't really getting the Peterson. Got this random Gomber lineup. Again, I think that my lineups did end up more concentrated in this build than usual. I wouldn't be surprised if I lose a little bit of Green and or Skeens, and then it bumps up Savali and Peterson. But the reason that Green and Skeens are so in so many of my lineups goes back to also me just kind of jamming Cincinnati, as you saw at the beginning. They are cheap. You can afford these pitchers with them. So again, I don't like the way that turned out because I'm taking on so much ownership. Like I was just getting really, really highly projected lineups with what I did basically, where the Reds project really well. You add them with Green and Skeens, that's great. But such a large portion of the field is going to be doing that. I don't actually like getting to that in tournaments. If we look at like these Hunter Green lineups, Green plus Skeens, popular Reds bats, like it's just I'd rather be more different in large field tournaments, not only from an ownership standpoint, but also just like how popular that roster construction is going to be. So I think that's going to be different. I think that Hunter Green and Paul Skeens individually are obviously very good plays, and I wouldn't be upset if I'm getting a lot of them. But if I'm pairing them together in a lot of lineups, ideally I'm getting to like Pittsburgh against a popular Savali, or obviously not Colorado against Green. Maybe Cleveland against a pretty popular Flaherty, as opposed to going to like the most popular Cincinnati stack along with those two paired together. I think in most of my Cincinnati stacks, I would ideally have one of Green or Skeens and then a lower raw owned pitcher, and then probably a mini stack against like if I don't have Green, then a Colorado mini stack. If I don't have Skeens, maybe a Milwaukee mini stack. If I have Peterson instead of Savali, maybe a Pittsburgh mini stack. So I think in my head, that's how I would prefer those lineups to look. I think there's a pretty good chance that the lineups actually play do look more like that. Because again, it just seems like for whatever reason, the approach I took today really, really favored raw projection over anything else, which I don't really like. Offensively, as I mentioned, got to a lot of Cincy stacks. 19 out of the 50 lineups are 5-man Cincy stacks, 7 are 4-mans. I do think that comes down. But again, they do look really good, and there is ownership coming into other teams as well. If we go back or I guess I didn't even need to go back, looking at the raw ownership for the Reds, they are certainly popular, but getting like these guys down here towards the bottom that are 10 to 20% owned isn't that unusual for a 4-game slate. Mark Canha getting 22% ownership, or I guess he's not in the lineup, but when I ran stuff, he was projected for 22%. Yeah, so you can see my data is a little bit messed up because lineups came out as I was running stuff. But the point that I'm making is like Cincinnati is going to be more popular than anybody else. It's not going to be by a huge margin. And so if you do think that they are just that much more likely to succeed, or they are that much better of a value team, then it can make sense to just kind of be jamming them over the field. But that goes back to what I was saying about if I'm going to do that, I still don't really want to be playing them with Skeens plus Green because that combination is just going to be so popular. So there's a lot of nuance in kind of how I view Cincinnati here because I do think that from a value plus projection standpoint, they're pretty clearly the top slate or the top stack, no matter how you look at it. So that's why they're showing up a lot, but it's fine to play them a lot. You just want to then be not playing them in the same way that everybody else that's playing them is playing them. And I think right now the lineups that I built are doing that. So that's a problem. As far as the other stacks go, getting to Pittsburgh against Savali, I do like that component. Obviously, I'm not thrilled with how much Cincinnati I was getting, but I mentioned it when we went through the overview at the top. Some of the pitchers that are popular, Savali, I think is my favorite to target against because he's getting more ownership than every pitcher other than Skeens and Green, who are obviously much better than him. He's in a hitter-friendly park as opposed to Flaherty or Gore or Peterson. The Pirates don't have the best lineup, but they do have some power. They do have some stolen base upside. If O'Neal Cruz is in, obviously they look better, and I do have Cruz projected in right now, so I'm getting there. But Pittsburgh, I like, and then you can see kind of just like flat exposures between Washington, Cleveland, getting to some Milwaukee. So I think I am actually over the field on Milwaukee right now because they're probably not getting much ownership against Skeens. Getting to a little Colorado. Sean V mentioned Brenton Doyle playing really well lately. Yeah, he's obviously been great. You shouldn't be factoring that in today, but he has been great. If you are going to Colorado against Green, then obviously he's been playing well. He gives you some stolen base upside, has some power. He would look pretty good. As far as stolen bases on this slate go, hadn't actually looked at that specifically, but that reminded me of it. Hunter Green, not particularly good at preventing stolen bases, so that does look good for Brenton Doyle as well. He is the biggest stolen base threat on Colorado. Mackenzie Gore hasn't been good at it either. So guys on the Mets that would potentially run Lindor a bit. Bader's towards the bottom of the order and has some pinch hit risk, but good stolen base spot for him. We know that he is fast. Looking individually at positions, go over here. Tyler Stevenson, again, not surprising, showing up in a ton of the lineups I built. I expect that number to come down when I rerun stuff, but I still think I'll get a lot. And again, this is just the problem that you're going to run into with the Reds today, and it can be difficult, especially on a short slate, to overcome. It's not just that Tyler Stevenson is probably my highest projected catcher on the slate. Yeah, he's my highest projected catcher on the slate, but he's also only $3,600. And so you're getting the best projection. You're getting a value that allows you to get good pitching in. That's why Cincinnati's showing up as much as they are. And it's something that, again, I need to figure out exactly how to fix. But they, Tyler Stevenson looks great. The rest of the catching pretty flat. Carson Kelly hitting fifth looks pretty good. Bo Naylor, Keibert Ruiz, if they're in the lineup, look fine. At first base, I assume Candelario is going to be the highest guy for me, and he is. Again, 4,300 first base and third base eligibility. Looks really, really good. Juan Yepez, if he's in the lineup against the left-handed Peterson, looks fine. He will have pinch hit risk, especially depending on who exactly is in that lineup. Spencer Steer, kind of interesting that I'm only getting 12% of him, even though I'm getting to so much Cincy. I think that is a function of how much overlap I have between Hunter Green plus Paul Skeens plus Cincinnati. It's making it difficult to get to 5K. Pete Alonso, if you're getting away from Cincinnati, does obviously look good against Mackenzie Gore, even though it's a pretty tough matchup. Wes Anderson said what prompted the shift to pure projections? Just a change in what I was simming against. I'm not going to get into that on the show because it wouldn't make a ton of sense if you don't know my entire process, and also because I'm not getting into that on a free show. That stuff, if you are interested, again, I have put several videos out on the Endgame site talking about exactly what I'm doing process-wise. I made a small adjustment in something that I was doing there, and it kind of resulted in this shift that I don't really like. It's something that I talked about in those videos also, that ideally I think it's the best way to do it, but there were some flaws, and this is one of them. So again, if you haven't already checked out that site, link in the description below. I have videos out there going through my process, how I use Sims. Brick75 has videos talking about how he uses Sims. Uticow has videos talking about how he uses optimizers. Nerdy Tenor has several full series out talking about game theory and showing you the math between how you should approach different things in DFS. Brick has videos out on how to build your own projections, your own ownership projections. So all that stuff is already out. We have more stuff coming out soon. Monthly live question and answer sessions, answering whatever you want us to talk about. So check that out. Link in the description below. Moving over to second base, Jonathan India, again, getting a lot here along with Santiago Espinal. Second base, third base, eligibility for Espinal. I mentioned it before. There is some pinch hit risk on him, but I don't think it's as high. It's not as high as if he were not playing shortstop. Because again, the fact he's playing shortstop means that if they are just giving De La Cruz a day off, then Espinal is probably safe. If they're saying, let's give De La Cruz a half day off because we're facing a lefty, he's not as good from the right side, and then we're going to bring him in later in the game, which is certainly very possible, then Espinal probably comes out when a right-handed reliever comes in. So there is definitely pinch hit risk. There's just a little bit less than if he were at a different position. India at second base looks really good. No real pinch hit risk there. 4,200 looks great. Colt Keith, as far as the non-Cincinnati guys, looks good. Brendan Rodgers, if you're leveraging against Hunter Green would certainly be a guy I'm looking to get to. Offers value at 3,700. Good spot in the lineup, hitting second. Third base, Candelario should be at the top again, along with Espinal. Jose Ramirez sandwiched in between them. So I am paying up for him a little bit. He's only projected for like 8% ownership. So I'm getting a little bit over the field here at 12%. Curious to see, I guess, how many lineups or what those lineups look like. Green plus Skeens with a 3-2-2 Pittsburgh, Detroit, Cleveland. So getting to him in a non-Cincy stack, getting to him in a three-man Cincy stack, 3-2 Cincy and Cleveland. Again, I will play. I don't love 3-2 stacks, and I think this also might be a function of what I changed. But on a shorter slate, I am more willing to play them. But again, Jose Ramirez in a Green plus Skeens lineup. Here we have Green plus Savali in a full 5-man Cincy stack. Happened to get to Steer in this one as well, so that's pretty interesting. Just again goes to show like how easy the Reds are to get to. Here, going with Hunter Green and then Savali instead of Skeens, you get a good Cincy stack where you can afford Spencer Steer. You get a Jose Ramirez one-off. Like you can kind of just do whatever you want if you're playing Cincy because of how cheap they are. So that's why they're showing up so much and why it is a little problematic. Maybe they are just still kind of going under-owned, all things considered. I will, before the show ends, double back to that initial tab and see if I think that's the case. But I know that my ownership's a little bit messed up too. Shortstop, O'Neal Cruz showing up the most for me. That's pulling up my Pirate stacks. Obviously, if he doesn't play, that's going to change entirely. Javier Baez, 24% showing up quite a bit. He is cheap. Again, a good matchup against Howard as far as the starter goes, but bad matchup as far as the rest of the game goes. Shortstop's just a pretty weak position, though. Adames, obviously really talented, but has the matchup with Skeens. Abrams, really talented, but also really expensive in the lefty-lefty matchup with Peterson. I am still getting a little bit over the field on him, though. If I remember correctly, Peterson does give up, or has at least given up some power to left-handed hitters also. 237 expected ISO to lefties this year, 185 going back to last year. Does have a 28% K percentage against them going back to last year. So I'm not going to go so far as to say that it's a good matchup for Abrams, especially when you factor in the park. But I will say that Peterson gives up some power to lefties, and Abrams certainly has it. But overall, shortstop, not a particularly good position. If Cruz ends up being out, I assume that I just start getting to some more Abrams, some more Francisco Lindor, and then probably some more of just these random value pieces as well. In the outfield, Spencer Steer. Oh, I don't know. Oh, okay. So I had Steer 12% at first base. I didn't realize it sorted like that. That makes more sense. I was really confused why I wasn't getting Spencer Steer in considering how many red stacks I have. Steer showing up 38% in the outfield, so that makes sense. Resign showing up a lot. 3K, has some power, has stolen base upside. Just a really good value. Price tag is very, very slow to adjust. I do think he's going to end up getting probably more ownership than is projected because of recency bias. This guy got called up and immediately just started hitting triples, home runs, and stealing bases right out of the gate. So I do think that there's a pretty good chance, he's projected for 16% ownership. People are just going to want to click this guy. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if you just get ownership quite a bit higher than is projected on him. That's something that I'll probably manually adjust after the show now that I've noticed it. I do like Brian Reynolds as a one-off, as part of mini stacks, whatever it is. Good park for him. Nice park upgrade. In non-Savali lineups, he's a really, really good piece to get to. 168 expected ISO allowed to lefties by Savali so far this year. 176 since last year. Reynolds has power, so I like that. McCutchen, if he's in the lineup leading off, looks okay. Palacios, value bat. I don't love that one. There is potential pinch hit risk. Milwaukee does have several left-handed pitchers in their bullpen, so they can match up with lefties. But he is cheap, so he's probably driving a lot of Green plus Skeens lineups as well. If we look at those lineups, Green plus Skeens, yeah. So he's basically just being used as the third piece, second or third piece of Pirates mini stacks to get a lot of Hunter Green plus Skeens. And that's another problem there too, is he's not projected for a lot of ownership, which is good. So he's lowering the raw ownership of my lineups, but where the percentage of the lineups that have Palacios in the tournament, the lineups that people are playing with Palacios are going to so heavily skew towards Green plus Skeens that it's not being as contrarian as suggested when you're just looking at ownership. So that is something that I don't really love as well. It's one thing to say oh, I'm being contrarian by playing him, fine, but you're actually being contrarian if you play him with a different build. If you play him with Green plus Gore or something like that, that's a contrarian play. If you're playing him with Skeens and Green, it's contrarian somewhat, but you're still just going to have a lot of overlap. And the way I kind of think about that to like visualize it is, if you're late in the tournament, you're sitting in like 20th or something, and you have Palacios, and he hasn't done a lot yet, and it's like, oh well, he's low owned, so if he does something here, it'll probably help a lot. But if he does something like, and if Skeens and Green have both been pitching well, like they're the pitchers you need, a lot of those lineups ahead of you probably also have Palacios just because he's so cheap and he's going to be in a relatively high percentage of those Skeens plus Green lineups. So that's something else that you want to pay attention to, like if you're using optimizers, because they're not going to account for it at all. In Sims, they'll do a better job. They should do a better job of accounting for it as long as you have a good field that you're simming against that correctly has Palacios in like a high percentage of Skeens plus Green lineups. So that's something to pay attention to for sure. Lane Thomas, I like him against Peterson. Gives you negative correlation. I'm getting to 20%. Fields at about 13. Negatively correlates with Peterson. Hits left-handed pitching really well. Obviously, the park sucks, but that's why he's not quite as popular as some other spots. Angel Martinez against Flaherty. Tough spot, tough matchup, but I'm getting around 2x the field on him. Alan S. said Sawinski. I got like 12%, so a little bit over the field in this build. Projected just to hit a little bit further down in the lineup. Has some pinch hit risk, again, depending on exactly what the lineup looks like for the Pirates. If Sawinski starts in center field and Michael A. Taylor's on the bench, or really if Michael A. Taylor's on the bench, there is some pinch hit risk just because Milwaukee could bring in lefties against him. Also, depending on the actual construction of the lineup, like if Sawinski and Palacios are hitting next to each other or near each other, or Tellez, Sawinski, Palacios are hitting near each other, it becomes easier for Milwaukee to bring in a lefty reliever and match up with those guys. If they're spread out, Milwaukee can still do it because they have multiple lefty relievers. But the more spread out they are, the more difficult or more unlikely it is that all of those platoon lefties get pinch hit for. So that would be something else to pay attention to when we get that Pittsburgh lineup. And then the last thing I wanted to look at, I wanted to go back to that initial crunch I ran and just see how optimal percentages look compared to ownership for Cincinnati. So, yeah, I mean, I have them going a little bit over-owned. Steers ownership, I think, is pretty much correct. Candelario, I think, is pretty much correct. Stevenson, I think, is going a little bit over-owned, but still obviously a really, really, really good play. Same for India. Espinal, Marte, Hines, all pretty much correct as far as ownership goes. Although, again, I think Hines' actual ownership ends up coming in higher. So, this is why Cincinnati's showing up so much for me. I do think that I probably end up walking them back a little bit, but one way or the other, I think I'm going to get a lot of red stacks today. Hopefully just can find ways to differentiate within them. I do think it's difficult to do on this slate. I wouldn't be surprised, actually, like the more I talk through the slate, if you generally on 4-game slates, if you go and look at at least Saber Sim, I assume this is true across any of the sims that have post-contest sims, a lot of times the highest sim ROI players on 4-game slates are just lower than they are on bigger slates, which makes sense because a lot of times there's just fewer places to go. This strikes me as a slate where I wouldn't be surprised if sim ROIs in general are just very, very low because the Reds pricing just makes them such a good stack for so many reasons that getting away from them is not super appealing, but also playing them doesn't make it very easy to win tournaments because they're going to be popular even if they are a little bit under-owned. I wouldn't be surprised if this just shows up as a slate that had a very, very small edge to begin with because I think it's very, very difficult because of how cheap the Reds are and the fact that they have the highest total on the slate, it's very, very difficult to make lineups that are not red stacks, that are not sacrificing a ton in the way of projection, but it's also difficult to differentiate within red stacks without giving up a lot because it's so easy to get to the Reds plus Skeens plus Green. If you just say, okay, well, I'm going to play the Reds plus Gore plus Flaherty, you're giving up a lot in the way of projected points because other people are going to just play the Reds plus Skeens plus Green. So, the more I talk through it, I don't even know necessarily that I dislike how my lineups ended up looking here. I think it might just be a shitty slate for tournaments, honestly. I don't, which sucks. Like I'm still going to play it, but kind of talking through it and thinking through everything, I'm not even sure that I dislike the way my stuff looks. I think it might just be a really difficult slate to differentiate without making bad lineups. So, yeah, good luck, I guess. Obviously, not the most optimistic view of the slate, but to recap, Cincinnati looks hands down like the best spot to get to from a value standpoint, from a projection standpoint, from an upside standpoint. It's just a matter of figuring out how to differentiate within your lineups without giving up too much as far as projection goes. Who would you focus on the Reds to start a stack? Tyler Stevenson because he's a catcher, Jonathan India because he's a second baseman. They have the least opportunity cost probably. Looks like I'm getting to a lot of Noel V. Marte. So, okay, so that's a piece. Like him and Espinal, I guess. I'm going to those guys because they are getting a little bit less ownership. Marte hitting fifth at 3,200 is showing up a ton for me. He's one of the guys that I'm more over the field on. Marte as well, or Espinal as well, rather. Although again, with Espinal, he's probably coming out of the game if De La Cruz pinch hits. Trying to think like if maybe he would go to a different position, but Candelario is staying in. I assume Marte is staying in against a righty. Stevenson's DHing. Yeah, I don't know where Espinal goes. Like, they're not going to take India out. I assume they would just want Marte to play. He's like supposed to be one of their young stars. I don't think they're taking him out of the game for Santiago Espinal. So Espinal does have pinch hit risk. I think the only way he's not getting pinch hit for is if they're just giving Elly De La Cruz a full day. So yeah, that sucks, but he is low owned, he is cheap. So where I would to get back to the question, who would I focus on to start a stack? It's kind of a two-part question. Like the most useful pieces from the Reds, I think, are Stevenson at catcher and India at second base, but that's also reflected by the ownership. So I am still getting to a ton of Stevenson because catcher's so weak. At second base, I think there are some other alternatives. So I'm still getting a lot of India, but I'm closer to the field. In tournaments, I really like getting to Marte because of that relatively low ownership. He is cheap. He does have upside. Third base is the best position. So that's, I guess, where I would start in tournaments, it looks like. But if you were just like building a cash lineup or building a lineup in general, I'd be starting with Stevenson and India because they are at weaker positions. Yeah, so I think that pretty much covers everything. I guess I can take a look at which popular players I'm not getting to, since I am getting to so much Cincinnati. Right now, not getting to any Flaherty. So again, that's just a function of me jamming Skeens and Green. It goes back to what I was saying before, where it's not like Flaherty's not getting ownership. So the obvious answer to like, how do I differentiate from Skeens and Green is play Jack Flaherty or play Mackenzie Gore, but they're also getting pretty efficient ownership. And I think that the ownership coming into Skeens and Green is about where it should be too. I don't think either of those guys are really over-owned. So that leads to me kind of just losing Jack Flaherty lineups and playing more Green plus Skeens. So you can ignore Kana and De La Cruz. They were in, I guess, my ownership projections, but not in the lineups I actually built. I don't really know what happened there. Not getting the Francisco Lindor. He's getting 20% ownership. I'm not getting the much Savali. He's getting 30%. And I am playing Pittsburgh, so that part does make sense to me. David Peterson, I'm not getting that much of. And again, I was getting over on like Lane Thomas and CJ Abrams, so that part makes sense. Not getting to Detroit bats much in general. I do like that. That goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of the show. You have ownership coming into Detroit because they're facing Spencer Howard. This park is not good for home runs, and Cleveland's bullpen is good. So yeah, it's the best matchup against a starter on the slate. But there's a reason they have a pretty low implied run total here, and it's the park and Cleveland's bullpen. So Detroit getting 15 to 20% ownership. Like, I would rather be playing the 15 to 20% owned Reds guys for the most part than the Tigers here, even though you're getting the Tigers, in better spots in the batting order. So that's, an example of like, I would rather be playing Noel V. Marte, different positions, but $3,200 Marte projected for like 15% ownership or whatever. I'd rather be playing him than Wenzel Perez. So that's a spot that I'm not getting to. Austin Slater. I'm really glad this is happening for me. So even though I'm getting to all these red stacks, I'm not getting to Austin Slater. He is projected for 20% ownership. I got to like 6%. He's probably getting pinch hit for. Will Benson is not starting today. And as soon as the right-handed reliever comes in, you're probably getting Will Benson in the game for Austin Slater. So you're just going to have 20% of the field playing Austin Slater for like 2 at-bats against Austin Gomber. I'm good on not getting to that spot. If it were a bigger slate, I'd be more willing to play him because his ownership would come down. And, he does positively correlate to all these other really good Reds plays. But he, on a shorter slate, is going to be popular. And that is also a way to differentiate at least a little bit within red stacks, is not having Slater in there as one of your value pieces. So not getting to him, I do really like that. Keeper Ruiz, I'm not getting to a ton of. But yeah, so those are some of the guys at the top that are popular that I'm not getting. And I do actually like the way that's looking. So the more, I don't know, the more I've talked through the slate, the less I actually hate overall what my lineups looked like with the changes that I made. It might just be a function of how this slate looks. But I do like that I'm not like I can very easily explain why I don't have Flaherty, even though I think he's a perfectly fine play. When you view it in terms of like how popular I think he should be versus his ownership, and then his raw projection versus Green and Skeens and the way that they look compared to their ownership, I would rather just be playing Green and Skeens because I think that the ownership's efficient on all three and they just project better. So that makes sense. Again, these guys, most of these guys I'm not getting to, it makes sense for me. Savali and Peterson, it's the same thing, that I can get to Green and Skeens so easily that I'm just playing them together because I think, again, I don't think either one is overowned. So that's really why my lineups look the way that they do. Again, I think it's very difficult to win top-heavy tournaments, large field top-heavy tournaments with a build like this. But I also think that a lot of the alternative builds are just kind of not really gaining anything and worse lineups. So I think it's just a difficult tournament slate overall. I think DraftKings really screwed up the pricing there. But yeah, that's all I have for the show. Unless anybody has any last minute questions, I'll stick around for a minute to answer those. But otherwise, I'll be back at 4 p.m. Same show. I'll do an overview at the top for the main slate. I will walk through what my tournament lineups look like. Hopefully, the pricing on that slate's a little bit better, and I'm not just jamming in one team. But I'll do the same thing there since we have that split slate today. 4 p.m. Eastern on the same channel. Don't forget to give the video a like, subscribe to the channel. All of that stuff helps out quite a bit. Subscribe to Endgame Syndicate. Link in the description below. Our goal there is to make you as good as you can be on your own. We all play different styles. We all approach DFS differently. Some of us obviously have had more success than others, Utica, but yeah, we all approach it differently no matter how you approach it, how you think about it, how mathematically inclined you are. There's somebody that should be able to help you get a bit better within your skill set. So check that out if you haven't already. Otherwise, thanks for checking out the video. I'll be back at 4 p.m. Eastern. Good luck on the early slate today.